Non-sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Warning. The following live stream is intended for an uncommon audience. Those suffering from religious zealotitis, idiotic use of the word scientism, or geoplanetary flatardation are advised not to watch any further, as this could result in symptoms including feeling triggered, loss of wokeness, or the need to comment in all caps. However, if you think bold ideas are righteous, unique perspectives are gospel, and strong opinions are sacred, then we say hallelujah. This is NonSequitur. Never follow. And now, here are your hosts, Kyle Curtis and Steve McRae.
Do and then kick it over to
you might want to tell Tim.
Oh well, I guess we could talk about it now, Steve.
Might as well.
You sure you want to break up?
Well, I've been kind of considering it.
So good though.
I know, but you got to. I'm young.
Welcome everyone. Steve and I were just having a marital
spat.
Yeah, but we're good now, at least for you guys, because we don't want to argue in front of the children, right, Steve?
Mommy and Daddy are fine. We're fine.
Awesome. Welcome back, Tim. It's good to have you back with us. I'm excited to hear what you're going to be talking about tonight. How have you been since last we spoke?
Yeah, busy, man. I've been doing sort of non-history stuff like making money and my career. But this is what I do for a hobby, so it's great to be back.
Money and career is always good. You never go wrong there. I like the Tosh.0 comment where he said, if you think money doesn't buy happiness, try frowning on a jet ski. So let's go through what we've got coming up for the next couple of days. Again, I can't see, so if I get a little too far ahead, bear with me. Tomorrow, we are going to be having a discussion on Egypt. And about 2 weeks ago, we had Brian Forrester come on the show and made some claims that I can get behind, and then some claims that I can't. And one of those was that the obelisk that could potentially power Wi-Fi. I'm looking forward to hearing the rebuttal on that tomorrow. I can't wait to to understand that. But that's going to be tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern. On Monday, last night we had Robert Sungenis, who was debating for the claim of geocentrism, and it was a very technical debate. It was a very good debate. I enjoyed it. Monday is not going to be as technical. Monday is going to be more dumpster fire-esque, if you will, because he will be not so much focusing on the geocentric model, but shifting over to try to refute allegedly Dave's flat Earth model. And if you remember allegedly Dave, he is notorious here on the show for his views on urine therapy and free man of the land. And I have, in lieu of his visit, been catching up on Free Men of the Land this weekend. And you can ask Steve, I'm highly pissed off by some of the things that I saw. So we'll maybe get some of those in too. Tuesday is Soul Phone. That's the one that Steve and I are looking forward to the most coming up. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to Skype somebody on the other side, we're going to find out all kinds of things. If they have, good connection on heaven's side or hell side. Do you even get Wi-Fi in hell?
I don't know, but if you hear screaming, do you want to carry on the conversation any further? I don't know. If you hear these tormented sounds, I'm like, I'm done.
I don't think so. And I think that's all the slides that I've sent in. Just remember that Friday, huge day, we will be having the debate that has been 2 years in the making with Redline and, Red's Rhetoric, the artist formerly known as Redline, and Jeranism. This is a debate that Reds has been trying to get for 2 years. Until here recently, Jeranism has avoided that, I guess would be the right way to say, or put parameters on it that weren't really reasonable, but has since retracted that. So that's finally going to happen on Friday the 13th. As you know, we usually do roasts on Friday the 13th. We will be shifting that in lieu of this to Saturday, and we will be roasting the Flat Earth on Saturday. So if you remember the Kent Hovind roast, it will be that for Flat Earth. And how can you ever run out of content there? So yesterday I put out there, I kind of hinted at the fact that I was looking for a new co-host, and I'm very organized and I like to be on top of things. And the reason I'm looking for a new co-host is because Steve will be dead soon. And the reason Steve will be dead soon is because he has a crazy ex-roommate that is the type of person that you see on Dateline NBC. And I don't think Steve has very long, based on
I'm on my last few days, I'm sure.
Right. And to prove that, in case you guys don't really believe that, Steve's going to play a voicemail for you guys that was left for him, and I'm going to let him set it up and then let you guys listen to the crazy.
Yeah, and before I set it up, let me tell you, I was listening to the Godless Iowans stream this morning, and they had Digital Hammurabi on, and one of the questions I got to ask was, what was the frequency of the obelisk for the Wi-Fi they had? And I was like, it was 802.11g, and if they had multi-channel architecture. And do you know what? They refused to answer that question. I think they're hiding something. Just conspiracy time. I'm just saying. Love
Dr. Bowen.
Yeah, love Dr. Bowen, but they didn't answer that question, so I think they know the truth.
Put your name down.
We're gonna get to the bottom of this. I guarantee it. We're gonna find out the frequency of this Wi-Fi.
Makes sense.
So let me give you guys just a minute rundown of what Kyle's talking about. You guys may have known from my channel, I used to read some letters from a psycho ex-roommate that we had, and they kept getting progressively worse. Well, he decided to sue us, and he had a lawful eviction. He was been gone for quite a while. His stuff's gone. The only thing I got of it was a nice suit, only worth about maybe $100. He thinks it's worth $10,000. But it's Kenneth Cole reaction. You can buy it at Macy's for about $100, $120. So the day after the court, after the judge said to him, basically, your credibility is none. You have no evidence. This was completely lawful. You have no itemization of anything of value. Dismissed. This is the voicemail that we got the next day.
Brace yourself.
So you think you won in court for that little measly $9,000? Well, it just went up to $500,000. With my God, my law firm charges $5,000 an hour just for consultation. I'm turning the attorneys loose on you. Both of you, not just you, cousin, that you two butt-ugly retarded morons. Both of you. You have no money. He has less than no money. He lives in a closet, sleeping on the fucking dirty floor. It will garnish any money you ever make to the end of time, and I will take your friggin' house, and you will be living up in the hills with Rocky in a tent. As simple as this. This is your last chance. Because be honest with you, I don't want your house. And I feel sorry for Rocky, but I will take it. It's your last chance. Why? You start playing games with the judge? John, you have dementia problems. Sarah, you forget. We're driving, we're going to Walmart. Where are you going? You do an illegal U-turn. You almost killed 6 people. Then I tell you about law enforcement and the judge. You said, oh, local law enforcement, they'll just laugh when they see you drive like that. You have serious dementia problems. You didn't even forget. You knew the judge. You had the letters with a detailed list of what you stole from me. And you're playing your stupid games. You think you won? Because the judge is old and you're old? And you think you can get by with that? Now it's $500,000. Your last chance, because like I said, I feel sorry for Rocky. I don't want your house, but I will take it. And the situation is this. I'm moving back in immediately. I want my air conditioner with remote control installed and on. Then I'm going to come and do inventory.
Uh-oh.
What?
And check. And if anything's missing, we're going to go shopping all at once. We're going to go shopping, and you're going to pay for everything. You got that? What part of that do you not understand? I am moving in. I better get a text message from you today confirming that. Otherwise, there's nowhere you two idiots can hide. My law firm will hound you from now to the end of time. It's already in place. The records that he was asking for, the witnesses, the list of witnesses, Everything. My law firm has that complete detail. I just came from, who delivered the furniture? He's willing to sign depositions saying about what he saw in my room, the $10,000 suit I was wearing. You cannot, I wouldn't want to be you.
Excellent.
and you guys may remember, he actually physically assaulted me one time. He grabbed my throat and I took him down to the ground. So I've actually have a standing order that if he comes on the property, I will knock his ass out.
Steve, he's moving back in. He made that very clear.
Yeah, very, very clear. And the AC has to be on. So we are in a little bit of a situation because this guy's not going to give up, even though we're getting a temporary restraining order. So if I die in the next couple of days, just don't take my shit, burn it, just get rid of it.
Right. And if you are interested in being the next Steve McRae, you can download an application at NonSec Show. That's NonSeq show.com/replace Steve.
Tim seems cool.
Replace Steve on Twitter.
Tim's
okay.
Let's do
now. We're actually just going to do a cardboard cutout of you, Steve. Tim, let's talk about the Library of Alexandria and actually, before we do that, you wanted to kind of touch on your last visit with us and some feedback that you've been getting and some kind of, people's opinions on that. So let us talk to us about what you found out after your first appearance here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me back, guys. And I must say that voicemail is a hard act for me to follow. I like the sound of the $10,000 suit. It's
a nice suit. I'll tell you what. I'll get it sometime and I'll show it to you guys. I'll during the show. When I leave, I will go get it. I'll show it. It's a nice suit. Not gonna lie. But it's
by the way,
it's a $100 suit.
By the way, that's the season finale, guys, of NonSequitur in the fall. Steve versus his crazy ex-roommate live here on this show.
That was by the way, that was only one of 9 emails or voicemails that he left. So
I can imagine.
We'll be playing more, I have a feeling, eventually.
That's crazy. Look, it was great to be on the show last time, and I certainly got a lot of great feedback, and it was good to see some of the comments, and it was good to see that there were some people who perhaps maybe thought that some of the stuff I said wasn't that convincing, and then in conversation later on were convinced. So that's nice. Others weren't. That's fine. That's life. I did find some of the comments though, when I went back and had a look at the chat that was running during the show. Some of them were amusing. There were a couple of people who they were really trying hard to find reasons to disagree with me, and bless them. That's nice. The guy that really made me laugh though was the guy who pointed out. We thought it was worth pointing out that I was drinking water from a beer glass. I'm doing it again. He actually thought that was a comment worth making, to which I'd say it's 10 in the fucking morning here in Sydney. If I was drinking beer from a beer glass at 10 in the morning, that would be worth a comment. But
yeah, that would be an issue.
Yeah, not really.
I would have a problem.
Not really.
Okay, it depends.
I call that a Saturday for me.
The other ones I thought were really funny. There was one guy who was working really hard to disagree with everything I said, and he said at one point, he said, "This guy's wrong. Atheists don't say that Christians caused the Dark Ages." Seconds later, another guy said, "This guy's wrong. Christians did cause the Dark Ages."
Love it.
And I was like, yeah, maybe we should let those guys kind of sort that out amongst themselves. We'll be here when they get back.
I've always said that 2 people can watch. And they do this all the time with our show. You can have 2 people watch the same stream, and you have 9 different opinions on that one stream that didn't even happen. Like there are some comments that we read that it's just like somebody's watching a completely different video that has nothing to do with it. So I mean, you are at least in good company, and that is not outside the norm in our comment section, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's bizarre too, because look it's video, right? You could rewind this, and they'll be like, "Oh, Kyle said blah blah blah." And it's like, no, Kyle, where's the timestamp for this?
Well, speaking of which, there was you remember we talked last time about how some people try to discredit what I'm saying by attacking me, and they say, well, this guy isn't a professional historian, he doesn't have a PhD in history, and I don't claim to be, and I don't claim to have one. But as I pointed out, I'm not presenting personal theories. I'm not presenting fringe ideas. I'm presenting mainstream consensus views by historians, and I make a point of avoiding anything that doesn't fall into that category. And if you don't believe me, you can go and read the historians and see for yourself. Minutes after I said all that, so I said, look, if you're disagreeing with me, you're not disagreeing with me. You're not disagreeing with my qualifications. You're disagreeing with the qualifications of the experts that I'm referring to. Seconds or minutes later, someone said, what published research has this guy got? It's like, come on, guys, try and pay attention. Right?
That's not convenient to trying to take away from your argument, though. Like facts, they can't deal in facts. That just wouldn't work in trying to discredit anything you say.
Yeah, so I thought that one was kind of funny. One point that was sort of being made, which I think is worth addressing. Some people were saying that I was generalizing about what atheists say about history. And to that, I'd say, yes, I was. Because obviously what I can't do is I can't individually talk about every single atheist or even every single famous atheist. But I'm addressing things that are topics that do come up. And so, yeah, I had to generalize about that. Also, they said that some of the counters to them I was making were quite broad and generalized as well. Yeah, because we're having a conversation on a video. And I could sit and read all the sources to you and go through all the scholarly footnotes, but that wouldn't be a terribly entertaining conversation. If you want the details, so the ungeneralized version, that's on my website. So that's on my blog. Average length of one of my blog articles is somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 words. So they're reasonably detailed. And if you think I say something that I haven't substantiated, then I've got a comment section, and I'm more than happy to interact with people if they have questions.
Tim, real quick, your audio is like going way high and real low, and the outside is kind of blowing their eardrums. Do you have a filter on your mic, perhaps, like a gain clip or a filter or an acoustic adjustment, a surround sound, or anything that might be a loudness equalizer?
Maybe move it back.
It'll start loud and then get really soft.
Real loud.
Right. Okay. No, sorry about that, Steve. Well, can we push on? What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's doing it right now, but we can push on.
Okay. So that, I think that were just a couple of comments that I thought were kind of amusing. And even today, there was a comment by someone who said that they'd never heard any atheists say that Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria. I find that a little bit hard to believe. Have you guys heard atheists say that Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I start my article on my blog about this particular topic with 10 separate quotes from 10 different atheists saying exactly that. So, feel free to disagree with me on matters of fact or interpretation, but saying stuff like that is just plain stupid. But most of the comments were, really positive, and I was really happy to interact with the people in the comments afterwards as well.
Well, I'll tell you, that you and I'd probably be you and Greater Sapien are probably the two most requested guests that we've had, because after you came on, we had a big influx of people saying he has to come back on. We actually, in our hangout, our Patreon hangout today, had two people say that your episode was their favorite, and that they were wondering when you were coming back. So they were happy to hear that you would be back tonight. So,
cool. They were your shills, right? I mean, you have your shills.
Yeah, I paid them well.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you too about, right before we start with the library at Alexandria. There is also another pressing issue that I saw in the UK Mirror. It was a news article, and I want to see how you're going to respond to this. But they said that it is now claimed that Australia does not exist, that it is a made-up country by Great Britain to cover up for a mass murder when they shipped prisoners off, and that NASA is paying you guys a certain amount each month in order to say that you're from Australia and fake that accent. How do you respond to those accusations?
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true.
I knew it. Damn NASA. Okay, Russian vids, there you go. Evidence.
That's a true story, then.
Yeah, that's all I can say. You've got us. You've rumbled us. It's true. There are no Australians.
Yeah, I mean, do you think anybody would want to talk like that? Let's say we got paid to do so. Come on.
Oh, come on. I wondered if you were going to say anything about my my Twitter post where I said, so throw some false claim on the Barbie and join us at 8 o'clock.
I thought that was very witty, Carl. I thought
Thank
that
you.
was very good. Yeah, a little bit of a dated reference, but no, that's fine.
You know, I have to live in the glory days.
That was before your time, though, wasn't it, Kyle?
No.
Were you born?
Yeah, were you born?
I think when did it come out? When was it?
Oh, no, 1980 something.
Yeah.
I was born in 86.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In a week, I'll be 32. So
I wish I could remember 32, Carl. Shall we talk history?
Yeah, good point. Okay, so basically what we're going to do tonight is we're going to try to hit 2 points: the burning of the library at Alexandria and Hypatia. And I like the way that you sent that you're going to kind of structure this. And just to give everybody an overview, you're going to hit the myth first, what it was, what it wasn't, the science at the library, the Greek aspect of science, and the way that can't read my own handwriting, how the myth began. Yeah. So I think that's a good overview, and it'll kind of everybody listening. That's kind of the following structure that we're going to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim to just run with it, and he's told Steve and I to break in as we have questions, and we're going to do that if they're really good questions. But you remember what happened when we had Rick the coin guy on, so we're going to try to keep our curiosity at a minimum so that we can get through the entire library tonight. So Tim, whenever you're ready, it's all yours.
Cool. So let's start with the myth, and you know, warning, I'm going to generalize, but generally speaking, what I come across when I come across this myth on, or this topic on various atheist blogs and forums, is something along these lines. So the idea is that once upon a time there was the Great Library of Alexandria. It was this huge ancient library. It contained all the knowledge of the ancient world, and it was a center for study, for research, for science, and for technology. And it contained anything up to 500,000 to 700,000 books. It was enormous. But because Christians hated science and hated learning, one day a mob of horrible Christians came along and burned down the Great Library of Alexandria, destroying all of this knowledge, and thus setting back human civilization by 1,000 years, plunging us into the Dark Ages. And if it wasn't for the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria, we'd all be much more advanced, and we might be living in, you know, colonies on the moons of Jupiter or something along those lines.
We'd have flying cars.
Flying cars, yeah, or cities under the sea, all of that stuff that we should have. And it's a great story, and it gets told and retold. I've come across, you know, a lot of people might have seen the video that you see online from Carl Sagan's original Cosmos TV series from back in 1980. That's certainly how I found out about the Great Library, and that was the version of the story that I believed for many years until I actually went and studied it. And more recently, there's been a movie called Agora by a Portuguese, I think he is, director, Amenabar, which came out in 2009, stars Rachel Weisz, and it's a combination of the story of the Great Library, but also the story of Hypatia, because she plays Hypatia. And in that movie, the destruction of the Great Library is a centerpiece and forms like one of the climaxes of the movie. So it's a terrific story. The only problem with it is it didn't happen. I mean, there was a Great Library, but the whole bit about Christians burning it down isn't true. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about, you know, what the Great Library was, and also about what it actually wasn't, because a lot of the fairy tale version that I just told is based on this idea that it was a great center of science and technology, and that's part of the myth. So what was the Great Library? Well, there certainly was a huge library in Alexandria in the ancient world, and it was founded sometime in about the 3rd century BC, and it was a great center of learning. If you were, though, to go back to ancient Alexandria and you were to, in your fluent ancient Greek, ask a person, say, in the lower city, in the poor section of the city, where's the Great Library of Alexandria, they probably wouldn't know what you were talking about. And if you kept talking to them and said, well, it's a big building, it's got lots of books in it, and there are guys studying stuff, then they would say, oh, you mean the museum. And that's because what we call the Great Library of Alexandria was actually the royal library associated with the museum, which was a temple to the 9 muses. The muses were the goddesses of learning, so goddesses of the various arts and sciences. And there were these were daughters of Zeus, and they were the goddesses of things like comedy, astronomy, tragedy, and various forms of poetry, and history as well. So the museum was a temple to the 9 muses. It was attached to the royal quarter and attached to the palace of the kings of Alexandria, the Ptolemaic dynasty. So the Ptolemies were basically successors to the empire, part of the empire of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his enormous empire was kind of broken up between his generals, and the general called Ptolemy got one of the best bits, which was the very, very rich territory of Egypt. And he inherited a city that Alexander had founded there, one of a number of cities that Alexander founded, and one of a number that Alexander named after himself, because that's the kind of thing you can do when you're a god king. So he inherited this city, and one of the things he did was he built this huge palace complex in the royal quarter in the upper city, down on the harbour of the city. And in that, he built this temple to the 9 muses. It was either him or his son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. So what was the museum? Well, yeah, it was a temple, but it was mainly a center of study. A lot of the temples of the muses in the ancient world were, because they were the goddesses of learning, were centers of study. And what the Ptolemaic kings did was they said, come to my temple of the muses, come to the museum, I'll give you a job for life where you'll be able to study whatever the hell you want, and I'll provide you with everything you need. So the museum was kind of like, I suppose, a little bit like a privately owned university. And what you would find there would be not just the temple, but also apartments, dormitories, kitchens, a dining hall, gardens, and colonnades where people could walk and contemplate, and little alcoves where they could sit and discuss and study. The image that we've got, and I can actually see it in behind Steve, of this huge sort of echoing hall with stacks and stacks of shelves of scrolls, that actually didn't exist. So as far as we can make out from the one description that we have of the museum from Roman writer Strabo, is that the books were stored in storerooms off from one of the colonnades around, like one of the courtyards, and the main courtyards in the museum complex. So there wasn't actually a library in the sense that we would think of it, but there certainly was a collection of books that could be bought out for the scholars who worked there. And there was a whole staff of scribes and a whole staff of slaves. And if you wanted a book, you'd say to the slave, I want this book by Olympiodorus, and they'd go off and they'd find that.
Can I ask a question real quick, Tim?
Sure.
Where would these books come from? Were they mainly centered around works of people there in Egypt, or were they pulled from several different parts of the world?
Yeah, good question. A bit of both, but one of the things we've got to remember about the Ptolemaic kingdoms is, even though it was in Egypt, the kings and the ruling elite of the Ptolemaic kingdoms were Greek, and most of the eastern end of the Mediterranean in this period and well after was Greek speaking. So these guys, Ptolemy himself was a Macedonian Greek, and these guys were all Greek speakers. So all the Ptolemaic kings were kings of Egypt, but they were basically Greeks, and the books were largely books in Greek. Later on, they had a collection of books in Latin, and they did have some books in other languages. So we know that there were books in Hebrew, for example. We know that the Septuagint, which is the translation of what became the Old Testament of the Bible, into Greek from Hebrew was done in the Great Library of Alexandria. The other thing is that they gathered books to make sure that they were added to the collection. So there's one story, it may or may not be true, but there's certainly one story that any ship that came into the harbour in Alexandria, which was a major port, was searched, and any books that were in that ship were confiscated until copies could be made, and then the originals were given back. And also they went out to various places around the Greek-speaking world and got books, brought them back, made copies, and then sent back the originals. And there's one story about them actually taking the original writings of Aristotle, making copies, and then giving back the copies. They kept the originals.
Well played.
Yeah, nice. So this is how they built up the collection, and it was certainly a great centre of study, and it was probably definitely the biggest library, almost certainly the biggest library in the ancient world. But this kind of brings us to what the Great Library wasn't, and a lot of the myth is around some of these elements I'm going to be talking about now. One of those, for example, is the idea that it was unique in that it was so big. And I mentioned before that one of the things you often read, even in quite good sources, is that the Great Library was up to 500,000 or even 700,000 books. So it was enormous. That's a pretty big collection even for today. So for the ancient world, that would have been gigantic. The only problem is those two figures have been carefully selected from various figures that we find in the ancient sources. And if we look at those various figures, they range from 700,000, which is the biggest. That's found in Aulus Gellius, dating to around about 150 AD. But if we look at some of the other sources, they're all over the place. So we've got, for example, Isidore of Seville, writing hundreds of years later, said that it was 70,000. We've got Orosius, writing about 400 AD, said it was 400,000. But then we've got Seneca the Younger, writing about 50 AD, when the library was still in existence, saying it was 40,000. And then we have Epiphanius, writing about 380 AD, giving us the suspiciously precise figure of 58,800. Now, the interesting thing about these figures, they're all over the place. It's not as though the smaller figures are the earlier ones and the larger figures are the later ones, which would make sense if, say, the library was growing over time. Effectively, as some of the historians who have analysed this kind of have to admit, no one knew how big the Great Library was. And most figures in ancient sources have to be taken with a grain of salt. They're usually a way in which the writer is saying it was big, right? Mm-hmm. So military historians, for example, use the kind of divide by 10 rule. They say if they said that Attila the Hun invaded Gaul with an army of 500,000 warriors, divided by 10, it was probably about 50,000. So we really can't take any of these figures very seriously, and all we can say is that we don't know. We don't know how big the Great Library was. What we do know, though, is that it had rivals, and we can make some estimates about how big some of those rivals were. There was the Great Library of Trajan in Rome. Trajan was the Roman emperor in the early 2nd century. He built a new forum in Rome, and one of the things he built was an enormous library that was half Greek, half Latin works. And we know from the archaeological footprint in Trajan's Forum, I've been there and paced across it, so I kind of get an idea of the scale. It housed about 20,000 scrolls. So, and that was considered a very, very big library. So if that was considered a very, very big library, is it likely that the biggest library in the known world was 700,000? Possibly not. It also had a rival. The Great Library had a rival called the Great Library of Pergamon, which was in what's now modern Turkey. This was the kingdom of another one of Alexander's successors, the Attalid dynasty, and they founded a great library, and these guys were rivals. The Great Library of Alexandria hated the Great Library of Pergamon. It's a bit like modern universities, actually.
Library wars.
Library wars, yeah. And the story goes that they tried to sort of smother the Great Library of Pergamon by refusing to export papyrus from Egypt, papyrus being what was used for writing material at the time. So the Great Library of Pergamon countered that by inventing parchment and wrote their books on parchment instead. It's a good story. It's probably not true.
Touché.
But what it shows, yeah, exactly. What it shows is that there was a real genuine rivalry between these two institutions. We can make an estimate, we think, of how big the Great Library of Pergamon was, again, from its archaeological footprint. We think we know where it was, and it's probable that it contained maybe somewhere around about 30,000, maybe 40,000 books. So if it was considered a genuine rival to the Great Library of Alexandria, it's pretty unlikely that the Great Library of Alexandria was much bigger than that. So yeah, if I had to put a figure on it, I'd say probably somewhere around about 50,000, which if you think about it is kind of like the divide by 10 rule that the military historians use. Instead of 500,000, it's about 50,000. That's an immense number of scrolls, and that definitely makes it the biggest library, as far as we can tell, in the ancient world.
What did they, just real quick, let me ask you, what kind of subjects did they cover? Like, did they focus on a specific subject, like science, mathematics, literary, or did it, span everything?
Yeah, good question, and that's another one of the, I suppose, the elements of the myth. So the myth is that it was very much a center of science, that it was like almost like an ancient version of MIT or something like that. And Carl Sagan is probably one of the culprits here, where he really put a lot of emphasis in his TV series in the 1980s on the idea that it was a great center of science. Now, they certainly did study what we call science, what they call natural philosophy, and there's no doubt that it definitely was, that was among the things that they studied. But if we look at the scholars that we know actually worked there, and particularly if we look at the list of the people who were heads of the museum, and we've got a number of their names, and look at what we know they wrote, the main thing that they studied there was poetry. So ancient Greek poetry was very important in ancient Greek culture. And so the works of Homer, the works of Hesiod, the works of Pindar and various others, this was a major focus of what they were studying. They invented things such as the idea of a critical text. When they gathered together various copies of Homer from all over the ancient world and compared them, they found that there were vast differences. Sometimes whole sections of the poem appeared in one manuscript but not in another. And so they spent a lot of time, centuries, trying to work out what the original text of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey actually was. And this is something that, editors of Shakespeare or editors of Chaucer or editors of any sort of pre-modern literature does to this day, because we have the same problem. So they invented that. They also did a lot of work on dictionaries, lexicography. So they came up with the idea of a dictionary where you have the word, some information about its grammatical structure. So is it a noun, is it a verb, is it an adjective, a definition, and then some quotes from famous works that use that word to show you how that definition, what that definition means. You open a dictionary today or get online and look at a dictionary, that's exactly what you find. These guys invented that. They also invented a pretty simple to us idea, but a fairly radical and useful one, alphabetical order. So when you've got 50,000 scrolls in your library, it can be hard to find those scrolls, particularly if you're one of those poor slaves who had to go and find them for the scholars. So they came up with the idea of actually ordering things by alphabetical order. So they studied a lot of interesting stuff. Did they study science? Yeah, they did. But again, this gets overblown. So Sagan, for example, gives a kind of a list of all the great scholars of ancient Greek proto-science, ancient Greek natural philosophy, and says that they all studied there. Most of the ones he mentions didn't. So Eratosthenes, who was the guy who I think we talked about last time, who estimated the size of the planet, he did study there. Conon of Samos is another ancient Greek proto-scientist, studied there. Ptolemy, who was the guy who came up with the Ptolemaic model of the cosmos, that geocentric model that you're going to be talking to your friend about.
He would be happy for that.
He studied there. But some of the others that get referred to as being scholars of the Great Library didn't. So Archimedes almost certainly didn't. He lived on Syracuse. We've got no information about him even visiting Alexandria. Euclid may have, but that depends on when the museum was actually established, and so we can't be sure that he did. And there are various others that may or may not have.
Isn't the guy that invented or supposedly invented the first working, I don't want to say clock, but like a timer system?
That'd be Hero of Alexandria or Heron of Alexandria. Yeah, he probably did study that. Okay. We're not certain, but he probably did. He was a little bit later, so he may or may not have. So it certainly was a centre of that kind of study. But what we've got to remember is that everyone in this period, all philosophers, were basically polymaths. So they didn't. It wasn't like these days where you had someone who was a mathematician and someone else who's an astronomer and someone else who studies literature. These guys studied it all. There were some that had specializations, but on the whole, they tended to range across a whole range of topics. So Eratosthenes, for example, his nickname was Beta, as in the second letter of the Greek alphabet, which was a kind of a slightly bitchy nickname because it basically meant he was second best at everything because he ranged across so many topics. Just shows that academics could be bitches even back then. So it wasn't. It's great. It's great, isn't it? Yeah. So I think the other thing we've got to remember though is that, I mentioned already these other libraries. Part of the myth is that the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria on its own somehow destroyed the knowledge of the ancient world. Now you just have to think about that for a couple of seconds and think that doesn't make any sense. Why would they have all their books in one library? Were these people fucking idiots or what? Now, obviously they didn't, and there were all these other libraries, and I mentioned the ones that I've already covered. The Library of Trajan in Rome, the Library of Pergamon is the other big one, and then there were various others. There was the Great Library of Celsus in Ephesus. There was a library in Antioch. There were about 5 major libraries in Rome, and there were lots of small libraries. Bathhouses.
Real quick too, Tim, under the left paw of the Sphinx. I didn't know if you knew that.
I'm not touching that, Carl.
Okay.
See, he won't admit to it either. You guys think there's not a conspiracy going on? There's a conspiracy going on.
Yeah, I'm not touching that, Carl.
Okay, fair enough.
So obviously, if there are all these other libraries in the ancient world, the destruction of one library isn't going to destroy all the knowledge of the ancient world. So that just doesn't make any sense. The idea that they were studying a whole lot of science there is the other thing that gets people very, very excited about the Great Library. And as I said, it is important to realize that, yes, they did study stuff that we consider to be scientific topics. It's also important to realize that ancient Greek science and modern science are not the same thing. And that's why I tend to refer to ancient Greek science as proto-science or just as natural philosophy. So what you sometimes get is this impression that the Great Library was a whole lot of people sitting around coming up with plans for flying machines, or I've had people say to me, well, they were discussing atomic theory at the Great Library.
Yeah,
they were discussing atomic theory. In fact, the whole word atom comes from the ancient Greek, atomos, meaning uncuttable or indivisible. And they certainly were discussing atomic theory, but that doesn't mean that they were discussing it in the way that, say, modern scientists discuss it. Yeah, so what they were doing, it was a metaphysical conversation. So they were saying, okay, if you take a piece of marble and you cut it in half, you've got 2 pieces of marble. If you cut those in half, you've got 4. You can keep going. How long do you keep going for? So it was a very abstract conversation about, is there a point where you can't cut it anymore? Is there a point where you come to something that's indivisible? So it was a very abstract and philosophical concept. It is the point of origin, and certainly the origin of the word, and the point of origin for the concept of what we call atomic theory. But real modern atomic theory, scientific atomic theory, didn't come about until the 18th and 19th centuries with the study of chemistry. That's where real atomic theory began. They took the Greek word, but that was a scientific study. No one walked away from a conversation about atomos, about atoms, in Alexandria or ancient Athens, and thought, I think I'll build a machine to try and examine the structure of these indivisible particles. No one walked away thinking, I think I'll do some experiments with chemistry, which didn't exist, by the way. I'll do some experiments with chemistry to work out the fundamental nature of atomic structure. So a lot of the stuff that people hear and think, they were doing science, They weren't really doing science in the modern sense. They were certainly doing some types of science that are very close to what we do. For example, astronomy, and certainly geometry and mathematics. A lot of the fundamental geometry and mathematics that we use today was studied in this period. And Euclid, who I just mentioned, is obviously the father of a hell of a lot of that stuff. And certainly they were doing some experiments. They were doing observations based on some careful measurement. But what they didn't do was put it all together in the scientific method that we know today. That didn't come about until the 16th century. So we have to be careful when we're talking about the science at the Great Library of Alexandria, or the science in the ancient world generally, that we don't impose a whole lot of modern presuppositions and project them back onto the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a huge point too, because atomism, like you said, was just a philosophical concept about indivisible components of something, and mereology, which is how things are built up from smaller things and what makes a whole. For example, like the ship of Theseus, right? You replace some parts, is it still the same thing? In that perspective, the mereology and nihilism, objects don't even exist, right? They're just atoms in that type of philosophy, and the only thing the atoms are the elements. So yeah, I heard that, when people say, "Oh, look at the ancient Greeks, they knew about atomic theory," and since my background was atomics, I'm like, no. They didn't at all.
If they are able to create a obelisk that can send and receive Wi-Fi, I think that they're capable of coming up with atomic theory. You guys don't give them enough credit. And
they didn't have teleportation, though. If they didn't have quantum teleportation, they weren't shit.
Yeah,
I'm disgusted with you right now, Steve.
Yeah, quantum teleportation or nothing. They were not advanced enough. We can teleport. We've done it.
Shameful.
So again, I'm not touching any of that. So
you notice that, you guys pay attention to this.
Wait, I had one more. Let me just go ahead and get it out of the way before we move on. I had one more. When you talked about they weren't sitting around talking about flying machines and all of this stuff, I will have you know that there are hieroglyphs in Egypt that depict a helicopter and an airplane.
No.
By the way, guys, I'm kidding. Those are two hieroglyphs that were stamped over top of each other.
That's it.
Just want to put it out there. That was a joke.
Yeah. I think the other thing, though, also to remember about ancient Greek science is that while they did sometimes apply it in practical ways, on the whole, the connection between science, or their proto-science, and technology wasn't of the kind that we have today. So today, quite often when I'm talking to scientists who work on very theoretical stuff, they get quite frustrated because they explain what they're doing to lay people, and there's this sort of pause, and then the layperson says, "Yeah, but what do you do with that?" And because in the modern world we've got this idea that science and technology go hand in hand, and the only reason you do science is so that you can do something technical with it. That wasn't the case in the ancient world. There were some cases of people who did apply their scientific ideas, and Hero of Alexandria is one. Archimedes maybe another to a certain extent. He also had some stuff to say about, that's for slaves and so on to do. On the whole, though, these guys were generally sort of abstract thinkers. They didn't get their hands dirty with technology in the modern way that say science is connected to technology. So the idea that somehow the ancient Greeks were kind of on the brink of a scientific revolution, and then the Great Library got burnt down and it all came to a horrible end, that just doesn't make any sense. I sometimes get people saying, well, what about Hero of Alexandria inventing a steam engine? And they say, well, steam engines equal scientific revolution equals industrial revolution. So they were almost there. What Hero did, he didn't actually invent it. Some other guy did, but he actually leaves a description on how to make what's called an alliopile, which is a tiny little brass sphere. It's got some nozzles on it, turns on an axis, you put a little flame underneath it, fill it with water, and it spins. Nifty little toy. If you put it in the middle of your dining room table for your cultured friends, they would be highly amused, and then you get on with your dinner party. Is it a steam engine? Well, no, because it can't actually do mechanical work.
Yeah, it's not an engine. There's different types of turbine theory, but that type of turbine is just a simple steam radio turbine is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't get any further than that. The other thing is they didn't they weren't able to get any further than that because they didn't have the metallurgical skill. So they weren't able to make a high tensile style of cylinders and pistons that is required for a genuine steam engine. They also didn't have the mathematics, and they didn't have the precision tooling. So they didn't have the ability to actually be able to modulate, calibrate the kind of pressure that you need, so that what you don't end up with is either a very expensive steam engine that leaks steam and does nothing, or a very expensive steam engine that explodes and kills you. That all came much later on. Yeah. So were they on the brink of a scientific revolution? Doesn't look like it. Were they on the brink of an industrial revolution? Almost certainly not. One of the main reasons they weren't on the brink of a scientific or industrial revolution is that they didn't need to be. The ancient world had a massive labour surplus. They had millions of slaves. And there's even a great story about a guy who invented some kind of mechanical way of hauling and erecting marble columns. And he showed it off to the Emperor Vespasian, looking for funding. And the Emperor Vespasian said, "That's very interesting, that's very nice, here's some money, now go away and don't build it." And when asked why, the emperor said, "What will the slaves do?" So this was really, it seemed to be something of a retardant, it's not the whole story, but it seems to have been something of a retardant effect on the proliferation of mechanical power. They had it, they didn't seem to use it as much. That came later, it came in the medieval period when they had a labour shortage. And so there was an incentive, an economic incentive, to actually start to use machines on a big scale. But that's where it all came from.
They didn't really understand the sciences and the physics involved. I mean, they put together, like you said, this thing was a sphere. They got these nozzles go out one way and the other way, and it just ejects steam, so it just rotates. They didn't know anything about pressures. Pressure wasn't even coming around to the like 18th century. We understood things with Pascal and Torricelli and Venturi. So they didn't know what they had there. They just, to them, there was probably a novelty item.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it was. Now, this is not to disparage the ancient Greek and Roman scientists or proto-scientists. They were very, very smart guys. They were as smart as anyone in the modern world. Ditto for basically the idea that people in the ancient world were somehow stupider than us is wrong. Ditto for the thinkers in the Middle Ages. They were also every bit as smart as we are. But it's I think what people don't realize is that technology doesn't work like a tech tree in a civilization computer game. Just because you got one piece and another piece doesn't mean that it automatically then moves up to the next level of technological advancement. What usually drives this stuff is economics. And I love, one of my favorite medieval historians says, unless you understand economic history, you don't understand history. And this is something that a lot of people I think don't realize. Economics is kind of boring, but you kind of have to study it because it actually drives pretty much everything we do. That and sex. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, believe me, I've had to pay for sex so many times. They are definitely intricately related with each other.
True. Okay, so that's what the Great Library was and what the Great Library wasn't. So how did it come to an end? Because the story is that a mob of Christians turned up and burned it down. That's the story that we get told, or versions of that. What we can say is that that libraries, first of all, in the modern world and in the ancient world, are incredibly expensive things to maintain. And while the Ptolemaic kings were still in power, which was up until about the mid-1st century BC, it was kind of their plaything, and so they kept it funded. There is some evidence that it started to decline in importance, though, in about the last century before the end of the Ptolemaic kingdom. So, for example, where there had been heads of the Great Library had been great scholars, towards the end, it seemed like it was a post that was kind of given to anyone that the king kind of liked. So we got a commander of the palace guard, for example, after he retired, he became head of the Great Library. Not a lot of indication that he was a great scholar.
Like the Republican Party now.
I was about to say, yeah, Trump sort of does that. You know, if you're an ex-Fox News anchor, you get a job in the White House.
Make Egypt great again, turbans.
That's exactly right. So what we do know, though, is that it seems to have suffered a major blow in about 47 BC. So 47 BC, Julius Caesar turned up in Egypt. He was doing a mopping up operation after a major civil war. that he had effectively won. He took the side in a minor civil war between the two parts of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy the 13th, who was a boy king who had the throne, was being challenged by his sister, who you may have heard of, a lady called Cleopatra. Cleopatra was fucking Caesar at the time, so Caesar took her side, not surprisingly, getting back to sex being a major driver of history. He then besieged Ptolemy in Alexandria, and his troops apparently came under fire by some archers on top of a building near the docks, and so his troops set fire to those buildings. And the story goes that those buildings contained a large part of the collection of the Royal Library connected to the museum, and thousands of scrolls were burned.
Mm.
Now, this is a little bit tricky because none of the contemporary sources actually mention this, but that's not too surprising since the two contemporary sources that we have that discuss the siege, one's written by Caesar himself, and the other's written by one of his generals, Aulus Hirtius. And they kind of had an incentive not to highlight the fact that they burned down a large chunk of the major collection of the biggest library in the ancient world. Aulus Hirtius also makes a point of saying that he actually says Alexandria could not be burned because their buildings were made of stone. Kind of makes it sound a little bit as though he was kind of trying to head off any accusation that he and his men might have burned down part of the Great Library of Alexandria. What we do find, though, is that about a few generations later, we do find lots of references to Caesar's troops destroying a large part of the collection of the library. That was after Caesar's dynasty had ceased to be the emperors of Rome. So it ceased to be politically disadvantageous to highlight the fact that that Caesar had done this. And then suddenly we get all these references to, oh yeah, Caesar's guys, they did that.
Can I ask a question real quick about going back to your point that you raise about people saying that how could it burn down if it was completely made of stone? I know that the scrolls and that would burn easy, but as far as like the structure itself, when you see like paintings and stuff of it, and I kind of over dramatize the thumbnail, but the actual place is on fire. How would that work?
Yeah. Well, stone buildings need wooden frames, and inside there are wooden fittings. So there's plenty of ways that you can set a stone building on fire, and there's plenty of examples of ancient cities which got burned, which were made substantially out of stone buildings. Stone buildings are full of a whole lot of flammable stuff, and scrolls are particularly flammable. So particularly papyrus scrolls, they go up like tinder. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that 47 BC, there's substantial evidence that a large chunk of the library was destroyed. Remember, I was saying that the library itself was actually the book collection associated with the museum. It got big enough, it got so big that they couldn't keep it all within the museum complex. That's why it seems that these warehouses down near the docks that Caesar's men set fire to contain part of the collection. We also know that there were a couple of daughter libraries, which were smaller libraries in other parts of the city, including one that I'll come back to in a moment called the Serapeum, or the Temple of Serapis, which contained part of the collection as well. But most of the collection was kept in what was called the Royal Quarter in the upper city, down near the docks and up near the Royal Palace. So 47 BC, the library certainly seems to have taken a pretty substantial hit, but it does continue after that. We have references beyond 47 BC to the Great Library. So what happened? What we do know is that it seems to have declined in prominence. We do get fewer and fewer references to it. And we certainly get fewer and fewer references to it being such a big library. In fact, most of the references to it being a big library use the past tense. But then in 215 AD, the Roman Emperor Caracalla decided that he wanted to make every able-bodied man in Alexandria join his army. The people of Alexandria didn't like that idea. He wasn't a very popular emperor, and so they rioted. And so Caracalla decided to turn his troops loose on the city to punish them. There was a lot of rioting going on in Alexandria, by the way. We'll talk about that when we talk about Hypatia. And so he set the troops loose. They went out of control, the way troops quite often do, and they started to sack the royal quarter. And we know that large parts of the royal quarter seem to have been burned in that period, in that incident. We don't know if the library collection was damaged, but we do know if you've got a Roman army rampaging through the royal quarter, sacking and looting, there's a good chance that it's going to have some kind of effect. Then to really make things kind of difficult, the Roman Empire almost fell apart in the 3rd century. So later in the 3rd century, there was a civil war that effectively split the Roman Empire into 3. And one Roman emperor Aurelius managed to pull it all back together. In doing that, he again laid siege to Alexandria, and he burned the royal quarter. And this is kind of where all references to the Great Library ceased to exist. This is in 262. Then just to make things even worse, in 265, there was a massive earthquake in the area of Crete in the eastern Mediterranean, which caused tidal waves across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. A huge tidal wave hit Alexandria, and we have accounts from Ammianus Marcellinus about ships being deposited on top of 5-story buildings and other ships being found 2 miles inland. So it was a massive tsunami. And of course, the museum was in the royal quarter, which was down near the docks. It would have been swamped by this huge tidal wave. So not surprisingly, we don't get any references to the Great Library after that. So it seems that there was no single burning of the Great Library of Alexandria. There were a series of incidents from about the mid-1st century BC through to towards the end of the 3rd century AD, which we can quite happily say would have systematically and gradually decayed and destroyed and finally wiped out the collection. We do continue to get references to the museum, but that seems to be the community of scholars rather than the actual institution. So we get references to the museum right into the 6th century. But this huge collection of books that would have existed in, say, like the 2nd century BC would not have existed by the end of the 3rd century. So that was the end of the Great Library of Alexandria.
Did anything survive from that burning? Did anybody scramble to, try to rescue?
We don't know. Look, the big one, the burning that we actually have some detail that actually talks about the library is the one in 47 BC with Julius Caesar. Now we know that didn't wipe out the whole library. We also know that Mark Antony, who ruled briefly with Cleopatra, she kind of got around with Cleopatra after Caesar's time. He went and plundered the Great Library of Pergamon that I mentioned before and brought part of that collection back to Alexandria to restock it after the burning in 47 BC. According to a story, we think something like that may have happened. So there's I suppose, yeah, no, again, you can do that when you're a king. So what I'm saying is that there was no single end to the Great Library of Alexandria, but what we can say is that by the end of the 3rd century, because of all the things that I've just talked about, we can pretty happily say that whatever had existed before didn't exist anymore. You might have noticed, though, that there's one group of people that's missing from the story I just told. Can you think of who they might be?
Pesky Christians.
Those pesky Christians, yeah. So where did the story come from that the pesky Christians were the ones who destroyed the Great Library of Alexandria? Well, I mentioned that there were these daughter libraries outside of the Great Library. There were about 3 of them, we think. Definitely 2, and one of them was in the Temple of Serapis. And the Temple of Serapis was in the outside the royal quarter, southwest of the city, and up on a major hill. It was at the highest point. It was one of the most magnificent temples in the ancient world. Everyone talked about it as being one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was a huge complex, richly decorated, full of treasure, and it contained a major library. We don't know how big, but it was regarded as a daughter library of the Great Library. So probably in the tens of thousands of books. This is where the story of the pesky Christians comes in, because in 392, might have been 391, a mob of people tore down the Temple of Serapis and destroyed it. And that mob of people was made up mainly of Christians. This is where the story comes from. Edward Gibbon, who in 1776 wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is for about the next 150 years was the main book on that topic. tells the story of how this was the end of the Great Library of Alexandria, because the Temple of Serapis held the last remnant. It was torn down by Christians, therefore Christians destroyed the last remnant of the Great Library of Alexandria. Problem is, that's not quite what happened. So first of all, we have to go back and look at why this mob of Christians was tearing down the Temple of Serapis in the first place. What had actually happened was that by that stage, that was the late 4th century, Alexandria was a majority Christian city, but it still had a reasonably active pagan population. And they were kind of on the back foot because they were kind of getting pushed more and more to the margins. At one point in around about the time of, around about 391, 92, the Bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, was renovating an old pagan temple that had been abandoned and was turning it into a church. He found some cult items, we don't know exactly what, some idols, and certainly an enormous phallus, getting back to sex being important, and paraded them. These were pagan cult items. So he paraded them through the streets to mock them. And the pagans were not happy about this. And there started to be a series of riots, this being Alexandria. That's kind of what you did when you were a bit bored in Alexandria. You'd start fighting people in the streets. So there were riots between the pagans and the Christians. A group of pagans went to the Temple of Serapis and used it as a base of operations for what was basically acts of terrorism. They hold up there, they venture out into the streets during the night, they kidnap Christians, particularly prominent Christians, drag them back to the Temple of Serapis, torture them, crucify them, and they break their legs and throw them down a well. The ancient world was fun, everyone had a great time, everyone going very, very well.
Blast,
Hey, we
man.
missed it.
Yeah, missed those good old days.
Those good old days. So this obviously annoyed the Christians, who made up the absolute majority of the population. And the prefect of the city then called out the troops, surrounded the Temple of Serapis with troops, and there was a standoff. There was a siege because the temple was actually pretty easy to defend. So there was a kind of a bit of a running battle. Both sides petitioned the emperor in Constantinople, saying, they started it. The emperor came back and said, okay, the guys in the temple can go free. We're not going to do anything to them. Yes, we know they've done some bad things, but they can go free. But the temple is clearly a center of dispute. So we're going to tear the temple down. And so he ordered the troops to tear the temple down. The pagan guys got to run away. The crowd were not happy because they were majority Christian. And so they joined in with the encouragement of the Bishop Theophilus. They joined in the destruction of the temple. What is missing, though, from all of the accounts that we have of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, and we have 5 of them, which makes it a very well-attested event, is any mention of a library. 2 of those accounts are hostile accounts, so they're hostile to the Christians. One is by Socrates Scholasticus, who was a Novatian Christian, but hostile to the Bishop Theophilus, yet he doesn't mention this destruction of this library. And the other is by Eunapius, who's a pagan, a philosopher, a scholar, and a vehement anti-Christian. And about 3/4 of his account is basically him talking about what arseholes the Christians are, what a pack of idiots they are, how stupid they are, yet he doesn't make any mention of the destruction of any library. So where did the library go? Well, we don't really know, but if we go back a few decades before the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, we find that there's a description of that temple by Ammianus Marcellinus, who I mentioned earlier, and he describes this temple in great detail. He seems to have visited Alexandria at some point around about the 360s AD, and he gives a very vivid, probably first-hand account of the appearance of the temple, but he says it has held great libraries using the past tense. So it seems that the reason we don't have any references to the library being destroyed when the temple was torn down was that it wasn't there anymore. So we don't know exactly what happened to it, but keep in mind that, as I said, libraries are very expensive things to maintain. Pagan institutions such as temples had dwindling funds in this period because more and more people were converting to Christianity, and a lot of the aristocratic and certainly the imperial, the emperor's sponsorship of these enormous institutions had dried up completely because they'd all become Christians. So it's quite likely that the scrolls have been sold off. We also have a couple of accounts of the temple possibly being ransacked in earlier periods. So they were probably stolen. So the idea that there was still a library in the Temple of Serapis when it was destroyed in 391 or 392, it's a nice story, but once you examine the evidence and put it under the microscope, there's nothing there. This is why when people talk to me about Christians burning the Great Library of Alexandria, I always say, please show me the source that describes this, and then sit back and watch what happens. And what happens is they thrash around, they can't find anything because there is no source to describe this.
Sources.
So,
who needs those?
Sources. Yeah, true. You know, I've got ideas, I've got opinions. Yeah.
Opinion is all that matters. Is there any idea of like where the structure stood or any kind of original piece to it?
Yeah, the original museum, we've got some idea, but the problem is the city of Alexandria, the modern city of Alexandria, sits on top of it. So excavating that is actually quite difficult. This is why we don't actually have an idea of the layout of the museum. We don't have an idea of how big its library holders might have been as a result. The Serapeum, the Temple of Serapis, yeah, we've got quite a decent idea of that, and the colonnades and sort of the underground parts of that, you can still go and walk around in those today. But again, probably not big enough, not enough there to allow us to estimate how big the library holdings might have been.
So is this one of those types of stories like 3 Men and a Tiger, where it's basically been passed around so many times that it's just kind of taken life on its own? But like you said, anytime you've asked anybody for any primary source, there's just nothing to it.
There's nothing there. Yeah, that's right. And because it's one of those things that everybody knows. Everybody knows that the Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria. And so it's not something that a lot of people bother to go and study up on. And also, unfortunately, because as we discussed last time, because atheists try to be rational but are just human beings, if people hear a story that appeals to what they would like to be true, they're less inclined. There's confirmation bias. So they're less inclined to actually explore whether or not it is.
Yeah.
The other funny thing that I find, though, is when I sort of present this stuff to people, people get very upset because they like the story. And they don't like the nasty man with all the books behind him, who's read books and has actually studied the sources. And so they try and argue against me, and they try and say, but yeah, there's nothing there.
I get that way when people tell me that Beauty and the Beast isn't real, because I hate it when people try to ruin stories from. Steve, I wanted to ask you too, you brought up 3 Men and a Tiger. Mm-hmm. Was that the ancient civilization equivalent of 2.5 Men?
No, it was a Chinese proverb of a story where the general went out of town, and he was saying that there were going to be rumors about him being talked about, and when he came back to the king or the emperor, they believed all the rumors, and it was something along the lines of, if one person said there's a wild tiger roaming around the city, would you believe it? And so it actually became this thing that the horrible rumors about this guy became true only for the fact that people were believing it, even though there was no validity to it. That's the story behind 3 Men and a Tiger.
No Charlie Sheen.
No Charlie Sheen.
Okay.
But let me ask you, because I have had similar things like with the Zeitgeist, with atheists saying, "Oh, look at the correlations between Jesus and this other mythological person with Horus and Vishnu and all these other things." And then when you look into any of these things, nothing.
Not there.
Absolutely nothing. And yet they'll swear by it. I've even had very big name. I'm not going to say who, but a very, very big name atheists actually even say, "Yeah, you know what? I was wrong on that," after they looked into it. But they a few of them were just like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." There, clearly the Jesus came from these things. Well, I'm okay with Jesus possibly being a myth. I'm okay, there might be some reasoning for things, but you cannot attribute things when there's no correlation whatsoever.
Well, they get the connection wrong there. That's the issue with that. The connections that Jesus has with Horus in the reference that it's supposed to be is astrological. The stars lining up at a particular point at a particular time. It's not that Horus was actually born on December the 25th. So was Jesus, and they muddy that connection. It was a star connection, not a actual date connection with that. They just messed those.
It's pretty big mess, though.
We're gonna drift into the Jesus myth topic, and then we'll be stuck there forever.
Right.
I think the moral of the story is check your facts. You know, we're atheists, we're rationalists. That's what you're meant to do. So don't just repeat stuff because you've heard it and you like it. If you're going to actually use this stuff in an argument, go and check your facts.
Can I give you a even more specific example of the second law of thermodynamics, which everybody knows this only applies to a isolated system, right?
Yep.
And so when I had a person one time say that oh, hey Steve, this only applies to an isolated system. You don't know what you're talking about. And I try to explain to him, look, that is true, but you can use multi-domain modeling and apply it to open systems as well. There's ways to use the second law of thermodynamics in a non-isolated system. And I had a friend who has a master's degree in physics saying the exact same thing, but this person didn't want to understand that, didn't want to know the reasoning behind it, ended up blocking us.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean,
they were like, you just don't know what you're talking about. Okay, fine, whatever.
And I suppose what I've learned over the years is you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And quite often when people try and debate me, if I see that there's even a hope that their mind might be open on it, I continue the debate. If I don't, I just pull out because, frankly, I've got a life, I've got better things to do.
Sometimes pulling out's the way to go.
Didn't work for me. I'm a dad.
Shall we talk about Hypatia?
Absolutely.
So these two myths are actually connected because quite often the story of Hypatia and the story of the supposed Christian destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria are kind of conflated or brought together. And I mentioned before the Amenabar movie, 2009 movie Agora. That's a biopic of Hypatia. But the first half of it is the story of supposedly of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, complete with burning scrolls and all that stuff, all the things that aren't found in any of the sources. So I suppose probably worth talking about what Hypatia wasn't first, and then I can go into a little bit about who she was and why she's significant, and then we can talk about why she was murdered, because she definitely was murdered. That's not a myth. But the myth is that she was murdered because Christians hated her for her knowledge and that they wanted to destroy the knowledge of the classical world, and so they reacted by murdering this great philosopher and scientist. So who was she, and more to the point, who wasn't she? What was she and what wasn't she? One of the myths is that she was a librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria. Given that she was in Alexandria around the late 4th century and the early 5th century, and as I just mentioned, the Great Library ceased to exist in the late 3rd century, that's clearly bullshit. And we also have no references to Hypatia that say anything about her being a librarian associated with the Great Library or associated with the library in the Temple of Serapis, which seems to have ceased to exist when she was still probably in her teens. So the idea that she was somehow connected to the Great Library, I know Carl Sagan said that she was. He was wrong. He was a physicist, not a historian. Don't get your history from scientists. And I know that the movie shows her rescuing scrolls from the burning library, and it was all very sad and very dramatic. It's only a fucking movie. Don't get your history from fucking movies. There's no connection between Hypatia and the Great Library. What we often find, though, is that she's depicted, because she was a mathematician and she was an astronomer, she's depicted very much as purely as a scientist. So she's depicted in many ways like a modern career academic, and she's in the movie, for example, she's sort of depicted a bit like a modern university professor. She's going what looks like some kind of lecture hall, and she's lecturing to people, and she's showing them diagrams, and people are asking her questions, and so she looks very much like something that we can relate to, and that's a modern scientific academic who specialises in astronomy and mathematics. We also have her quite often depicted as a rationalist and as an anti-supernaturalist, even as an atheist. And so I quite often come across these quotes from Hypatia, from her works, and people hold them up and say, look at these amazing quotes. She was such a free-thinking atheist. Here's my favourite one. Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myths, and miracles as poetic fantasies. To teach superstitions as truth is a most terrible thing. The child mind accepts and believes them, and only through great pain and perhaps tragedy can he be in after years relieved of them. Now, that's terrific stuff. I agree with that. All atheists, I reckon, would agree with that. There's only one small problem. Hypatia didn't say that. We know Hypatia didn't say that because we don't have any of the works of Hypatia. None of them survive. That quote and about 5 or 6 others that you see floating around the internet were invented by a guy called Elbert Hubbard for a book that he wrote in 1908 called Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great Teachers. Elbert Hubbard was a bit of a weird guy. He was a soap salesman who made a living writing books for school kids. And when he decided to use Hypatia as one of his great teachers, he was sort of stuck with the problem that we don't actually have anything that she wrote. So he just made some stuff up. So if you see that quote, it's bullshit. She didn't say that. It's also, she probably wouldn't have said that. So what we do know about Hypatia is gained from the writings of some letters of some of her students, and also our understanding of the schools of philosophy that she belonged to. But the idea that she was an atheist is one that I see a lot of people use. And again, in the movie, Agora, she's depicted as very much as a kind of an unbeliever. One of the bad guys is describing her at one point and says, "This is a woman who by her own admission believes in absolutely nothing." And later in the movie, she's being questioned about her religious beliefs. And they say, "What do you believe in?" And she says, "I believe in philosophy." So she's depicted as kind of a secularist, as kind of an anti-supernaturalist. I've had people describe her as being, the last bastion of rationalism against the rising tide of Christian superstition and so on. This is all a great story because it means that the story of her being murdered becomes more dramatic, because what we've got is Hypatia as the irrationalist atheist, the good guy, and being murdered by evil Christians who are superstitious and wrong, and they're the bad guys. Nice fairy tale. Total crap. So who was she? Well, first and foremost, she was a philosopher. And that's a bit that some people kind of skip over. They focus on the astronomy and the mathematics, but she was very much a philosopher of the school of Plotinus and his student Porphyry. So she was a Neoplatonic philosopher. This is the major tradition, and by this stage was the dominant tradition in Greek philosophy by the late 4th century, certainly by the beginning of the 4th century. It was descended from the teachings of Plato back in the 4th and 3rd century BC. And his teaching then splintered off into a number of different schools within the Platonic tradition. So that's why we call it Neoplatonic. She belonged to the school of Plotinus, though. And if we look at what they believed, tell me if any of this sounds familiar. First of all, they believed, and Hypatia believed, in a cosmic divine force, a supernatural force that was the source of all things. They called it the One, though Porphyry also called it the Father. And the Father, or the One, was this cosmic, supernatural, divine force that was the source of everything. Proceeding from the Father and emanating from him was a second supernatural entity called the intellect. Though the intellect was sometimes also called the Logos, meaning the Word. The intellect was an embodiment of the intelligence, the cosmic intelligence of the Father. Proceeding from the intellect was a third entity, a supernatural entity called the Soul, or the World Soul, or the Cosmic Soul, sometimes also called the Pneuma, or the Breath, which can also be translated as the Spirit. The Spirit was the way in which, or the Soul was the way in which we in the material world could interact with the cosmic divine. So through the Soul, we could interact with the intellect, and through the intellect with the One, the Father. We all had, according to this philosophy, we all have a spark of the soul within us, and it's yearning to get back to communion with the cosmic divine. And so Neoplatonic philosophy was about how we, as humans in the material world, can reconnect, elevate our minds above the material to the supernatural and reconnect with the cosmic deity. So was she an atheist? Hell no. She was not an atheist.
Was this some kind of sensus divitatis, that the knowing of a God exists? Like we all had some kind of innate knowledge of a deity?
Yeah, pretty much. It's complicated. It was based on Plato's theory of forms, which is where we're getting into some sort of some philosophy.
Triangles don't exist. That's all.
Exactly. Exactly.
I know. Explain that to Kyle. Whatever.
Maybe later.
You're on mute, Steve. I didn't hear what you said.
Triangles don't exist.
You're still on mute. What?
I'm not on mute.
He is. So she was not an atheist, right? She was very much a theist. She wasn't a Christian, but the interesting thing is, if you think about what I just said, I just talked about three cosmic entities, divine entities, who together form a connection between humanity in the material world and this supernatural world. So basically a trinity. So not surprisingly, a hell of a lot of Christians actually had no problem with this philosophy. And in fact, when we look at the list of students of Hypatia that we know existed, and we look at who they were, most of them were Christians. 3 of them went on to become bishops. So the idea that we have Hypatia, the atheist, on one side and the wicked Christians who hated learning on the other is totally wrong. Hypatia had students who were Christians who loved learning, loved philosophy, and found it perfectly compatible with their Christianity. And this is because Christianity wasn't some alien thing that came in from outside. It grew up in this world, and it grew out of Judaism, which had been permeated with this kind of Platonic thinking for centuries. And it then developed alongside Judaism and Neoplatonic paganism and with Christianity in the middle, and was influenced by those things from both sides. So there wasn't some huge break between Christianity and the philosophy of the classical world. They absorbed each other. And the idea, therefore, that Hypatia was somehow opposed to Christianity, she wasn't a Christian herself, but she would have actually, she did get on extremely well with prominent Christians. Does all that make sense?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So this kind of leads to the question of, if it wasn't simply that the Christians hated philosophy, because obviously they didn't, not all of them anyway, and if the Christians, and Christians didn't hate Hypatia because she was an atheist, because she wasn't one, why did she get killed? Because she did. She was attacked in the streets by a mob, and she was probably stoned to death, and she was dismembered. Her body was dragged through the streets, dragged out of the city, and burned. So it was a pretty horrible death.
Yeah.
So what was going on? The myth is they did that because they hated her because of her learning. But if we actually look at the evidence again, this gets back to Steve's point, things are quite different. So what we need to do is, first of all, have a look at the politics of Alexandria. You might remember I kept referring to people in Alexandria fighting in the streets. This was something that Alexandria was known for. So the politics of Alexandria was renowned for being both intense and also being potentially incredibly violent. In the ancient world, you had a series of hierarchies of authority and obligation. Everyone sat somewhere in a kind of a pyramid of hierarchy, authority, and obligation. The higher you were up in that pyramid, the more people you had who owed you favors, and that gave you part of your authority. You were sometimes born in high up in that pyramid, or you could rise or even fall, depending on maybe things you did, renown, your skill, political chance, getting the right appointment within the Roman administration, something along those lines. But everyone existed within one of these pyramids of authority and obligation. They also existed within interconnecting pyramids of authority and obligation, depending on who they were. In the earlier Roman Empire, Christians were quite low on these pyramids because they were a very small sect. They were tiny, they were weird, they were considered a superstition, a new religion, and periodically they were persecuted. Not as much as Christians actually pretended, but they were periodically persecuted. So Christians kind of had to build up their own little mini pyramids of hierarchy with their bishops at the top. So each city and each diocese of the later Roman Empire had a bishop, And the bishop was at the top of the pyramid of the little Christian pyramid of authority and hierarchy. And those pyramids were fairly unimportant until later in the Roman Empire, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And then suddenly everything changed. Suddenly Christianity became much more powerful because more and more people began to convert. And over the course of the 4th century, you went from a period at the beginning where Christianity probably formed about 5%, maybe 10% of the population, to the end of the 4th century, where they formed the majority of the population, particularly in cities, and particularly in eastern cities like Alexandria. And that happened over the course of about maybe 2 or 3 generations. There's a great book by Edward J. Watts called The Last Pagan Generation, which details this and sort of goes, traces that century and that transition. What it means is that where before the bishops had been quite unimportant, suddenly they became much, much more important. And this caused a bit of a clash in some of the cities of the Roman Empire. And that was what we start to see in the late 4th century in Alexandria. The bishop Theophilus, the guy who was involved in the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, was the first guy in Alexandria to realize that the bishop was probably about as powerful as the ruler of the city, which was the prefect. The prefect was the appointee of the Roman emperor. And so he started to throw his weight around. He started to exercise political power. He was succeeded by his nephew, a guy called Cyril. Theophilus had groomed Cyril to be his successor, but had died before he'd really got to the point where Cyril was the obvious choice. Bishops were chosen by popular acclamation in this period, not elected or appointed. And so Cyril had a rival, a guy called Timothy. And this being ancient Alexandria, they decided to settle the dispute by fighting each other in the streets. This is what you did in ancient Alexandria. So they started fighting each other. Cyril won, but there was always an anti-Cyril faction among the Christians of Alexandria. It was mainly in the upper city, amongst the aristocracy, amongst the administrative elite, and amongst the ruling class. Whereas Cyril's power base was in the lower city, among the poor, among the artisans, and among the people who lived in the rural areas around the city. So there was a simmering political dispute between the old faction of Timothy, who was now coalesced around the prefect of the city, a guy called Orestes, who was a Christian, and the bishop Cyril. Cyril then started to really throw his political weight around. He got involved in a dispute with the Jewish community. The Jews attacked, this being ancient Alexandria, attacked some Christians, killed some of them. Cyril decided to take it upon himself to expel the Jews from the city. Orestes, the prefect, wasn't very happy about this. There was a real dispute between Cyril and Orestes, and Cyril brought his tough guys in from outside the city. He brought in a group of monks who were hermits who lived out in the desert, and they came in as his sort of political shock troops. They came across Orestes in the street. There was another one of yet another clash. There was a riot. Orestes' bodyguard ran away. Orestes got hit in the head with a rock thrown by a monk called Amonis. And he then only just got rescued when some of the other Christians came to his, from the upper city, came to his defense. Orestes was not happy. That tends to happen when you get hit in the head with a rock. And so he had this monk arrested and tortured, and the monk died under torture. So now Cyril's faction were not happy because one of their guys was dead. And so they were out for revenge. And that's when they attacked Hypatia. We don't know exactly what happens, but what seems to have happened is they found her at some point outside of her house unprotected, and they attacked her. We don't know if the intention was to kill her, but that's certainly what happened. And then she, as I said, got stoned to death, probably with roof tiles or scara, and then was dismembered, dragged out of the city and burned. This dismembering, burning and stoning and so on, this is pretty standard stuff in ancient Alexandria. It actually happened quite a bit. There were a number of other people who had been killed in this way in this period. There was a guy called George of Cappadocia, who was a bishop. He was attacked by a mob of pagans, was stoned to death, was dismembered and burned. There was another guy called Bishop Proterius. He was attacked by a mob of Christians and was dragged through the streets and burned. This is sort of how you did it in ancient Alexandria. Again, the ancient world, not a nice place to live. So that's the story of how Hypatia was murdered. There's nothing in that story, and this is based on the earliest accounts by Socrates Scholasticus and by Damascius. Socrates was a Christian, but was a Novatian and was not a fan of Cyril's. And Damascius was a pagan, a philosopher, and was definitely not a fan of Christianity. Neither of them say that it had anything to do with her being learned. They say that it was a political faction fight, which is what it was.
Was anybody ever held accountable? Did Cyril ever? I mean, even if he
Yep.
didn't have a direct hand in it, even if it's just because he didn't like her and was, talking crap about her, was there any ramifications for him?
There seems to have been some. Again, the sources are a little sketchy, but there was an imperial inquiry, because this was a major scandal. She was renowned and beloved by both Christians and pagans. So the emperor inquired into what the hell happened, and it seems that there were some constraints put on Cyril and what he was able to do. So really, the emperor seems to have intervened on behalf of the traditional way of doing things, where the aristocracy were the guys in control. The interesting thing, though, is that Cyril ended up on the right side of some theological disputes that played out over the next the rest of the century, the 5th century. And so he became a bit of a hero, mainly for theological reasons, and so was made into a saint. This meant that later accounts of the death of Hypatia had to turn him into the good guy. So the early ones, the ones closest to the event, really do paint his faction and probably him as the bad guys. The later accounts are a account by a guy called John of Nikiu, who was writing 300 years later, had to turn Hypatia into a bad person. So he's the one who says that she was some kind of sorceress or witch. Says, just reading a quote here, she was devoted at all times to magic, astrolabes and instruments of music, and she beguiled many people through her satanic wiles. So this is where the idea that somehow she was seen by Christians as being a witch or being a sorceress or being a magician comes from. But that was 300 years later, and it was written by a guy who needed to turn Cyril into the good guy of the story. The earlier accounts, both Christian and pagan, make it absolutely clear that this was a political faction fight. And so the idea that she was killed because she was learned simply just isn't. Again, it's not there. It's not in the early source. Make sense?
Yeah, no, actually, it does. Like I said, I've tried to read up about Hypatia. I a long time ago, I didn't know much about her. It wasn't until somebody came into the group by that name where I actually had to go and kind of figure out who this person was.
Yeah.
And a fascinating story. But it was really bizarre because I never really found what the whole story was, what she actually was killed for. It was a political, was it just they didn't like the fact that she was learned? Couldn't ever figure that out. So I think this is actually really interesting about more information of what actually occurred with her.
Well, there is one later source that does sort of say that it was jealousy because of her superior wisdom. It's a guy called Harassing of Meletius. But he's sort of fitting with what Damascius says. Damascius says that Cyril used to go past Hypatia's house and used to see all the people waiting outside to go and consult with her. Because she was a philosopher, philosophers in the ancient world had a kind of a social place. So she wasn't some kind of lofty academic. They had a role of advising people in the best way to live. And they were seen as kind of above politics and neutral. And so people used to come and consult with them about all kinds of things. And it makes sense that she would have been advising Orestes, the prefect of the city, about this dispute with Cyril. It may be that she probably was more inclined towards Orestes, who was of her social class, the kind of guy, was a learned guy, whereas Cyril was a bit more from the streets. So it may be that the rumors that she was inclined, she was very much on Orestes' side, had some element of truth. But on the whole, she would have, given what we know about her and her philosophy, she would have seen herself as neutral and tried to be neutral. But that wasn't how she was seen by the mob. And so the other faction really saw her as being on his side. And when they wanted revenge for one of their guys being killed, they went and killed her and tortured her to death as well.
But it was disconcerting for the fact that not only was she a respected philosopher and educated, but she was female, but was it that they were worried that if that could happen to her, it could happen to any of them?
Yeah, look, it's interesting that it was unusual for someone of her status and her position, particularly a philosopher, to be attacked and killed in this way. And that really did cause a lot of consternation. And that's why the emperor intervened and did an investigation into the death. So yeah, that really shook things up. But what is interesting is that it was seen very much as being the politics of the mean streets of old Alexandria. That was kind of, we got a council to say, God, bloody Alexandria's again attacking people in the streets and killing people. It was something that they were kind of renowned for. There's two good books, though, that I would recommend on Hypatia. There are many things written about her and a couple of books out there which are complete and utter bullshit. She's a big topic for New Age writers, particularly of the more sort of feminist end. There's a couple of self-published books out there about her which are not worth, apart from being used as toilet paper, not worth buying or reading. There are two scholarly books that are worthwhile. One is Hypatia of Alexandria. This is by a lady called Maria Dzilska, which came out about 20 years ago, but is an excellent piece of scholarship. So that's definitely worth reading.
What's her last name, Tim?
It's Dzilska. Sorry, it's Polish. Dzielska.
Okay.
The other one is by Edward J. Watts, Hypatia, which came out just last year. And I'm a big fan of this guy. He's an excellent scholar of late antiquity and a very, very well-reasoned, very balanced guy who's got a great specialization in the social structures of the ancient world. So when I was talking about those pyramids of obligation and so on, that's very much sort of his perspective. That came out just last year, and I only just finished reading that, and it's a terrific piece of research. But he kind of goes through everything I was talking about, but makes it absolutely clear that ever since she died, she has been used as an ideological hobby horse. All of the ancient sources have their angle on it as well, and they're kind of using her. And certainly all the modern sources that turn her into a martyr for atheism, a martyr for reason, a martyr for science, a martyr for feminism, a martyr for paganism. She's been, or any combination of those things. She's been co-opted for all of those things. And it's much more interesting to go back and have a look at what we can know and piece together. It's a puzzle to piece together what we can know about her. Because I think that the real story, yet again, is more interesting than the myths.
I think a lot of people do that with Joan of Arc as well.
Yeah.
They try to turn her into a martyr for. She was a Protestant, right? The church burnt. Yeah,
It was Catholic.
Catholic. She was like 14, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she was
16 by the time they killed her. But yeah, she's another one that got caught up in politics.
But she probably had some mental disorders. Right? If not, did she not have some kind of a schizophrenia? They think.
It's hard to know. People in the medieval period, people in the ancient period, had visions, and it's hard for us to kind of project modern categories of what's going on onto them. Yeah, it's quite likely, but she was quite sincere about it. She was also a very smart girl. When you read the accounts of her trial, the guys who were questioning her were trying to trap her, and she was being very, very clever in the way in which she kind of stepped around their questions. But that's another story.
She's badass too, in terms of.
She was absolutely, yeah, really interesting lady.
Fearless.
Sorry, one thing I didn't touch on was the fact that Hypatia was a woman, which is one of the things that makes her very interesting. She wasn't unique, and sometimes people say, well, she must have been an Einstein level of genius because she was a woman, and despite being a woman, she still rose to these great heights of authority and prestige. Well, that's kind of true, but there were other women who were known as philosophers and as scientists. So we know, for example, there were some before her. There was a lady called Pandrosian. There was also a lady called Sosipatra, who were both philosophers and proto-scientists. Contemporary with her, there was a lady called Lescapigenia, and there was also after her, there was a lady called Adisia. Adisia is interesting because a lot of people in the myth, it's she was killed because they hated her because of her knowledge, and after she was killed, again the descent of the Dark Ages, and that was the end of all ancient philosophy. This is one of about 3 events that are supposed to be the beginning of the so-called Dark Ages and the end of ancient philosophy. That's actually crap. We know that philosophy continued and proto-science continued in ancient Alexandria right up until the Muslim conquest, which is where things really were disrupted. But after her time, we've got Heracles, we've got Olympiodorus the Youngest, we've got Ammonius, we've got Hermias. There's a whole range of guys, both Christian and pagan. John Philoponus was another proto-scientist, a Christian in the early 6th century. So it continued. But it's interesting that Adisia, in the generation after her, was a famous philosopher and proto-scientist, and she didn't get murdered by mobs of Christians. So it's not that you're a female proto-scientist and philosopher that gets you killed by mobs of Christians, obviously. So it's clear that she got caught up in a fairly unique set of political circumstances. There doesn't seem to be, this is the other thing that should be emphasized, there doesn't seem to be a religious element to the conflict. Even though Cyril was a bishop, Orestes was a Christian as well. And both factions were made up of Christians and were dominated by Christians. This wasn't a Christian versus pagan dispute. This was really, if it was anything, it was an aristocratic, upper class, upper city versus lower class, slightly more scruffy peasant faction. That seems to be the divide in this particular dispute.
Well, I think that these are the kind of talks that I could listen to like forever, and it always seems that these go by the quickest, in my opinion. They just fly by. But before we open it up to, if we have any questions in the live chat, I want to say 2 things. Number one, sorry guys that I had to step away for a second. I was for about 5 minutes up until that point, texting Steve and telling him that if I don't come back in a certain amount of time to call 911, because there was some kind of happening going on downstairs, and since I live alone, that shouldn't happen. So I was freaking out because something was definitely happening down below me, and it turns out that somebody jumped a curb and crashed right in front of my house. So I was hearing the after effects of that. So just in case you were wondering, I had to go for that.
My ex-roommate found him.
That's I was going to say, you guys live exciting lives. We got car accidents.
My heart was beating like 20 miles an hour going down them steps. I was like, oh man, what am I doing? I'm that person that I yell at in the movies, like, don't go down the stairs, go hide. That was me. So
I was just asking Kyle to get his stuff if he doesn't come back.
Just burn the hard drive. That's all I ask.
Yeah. As a friend, of course.
And while Steve looks for any super chats or questions, I had a question that ties back to Cleopatra that I should have asked then, but it just hit me when we were talking about the deaths of people back then. Since you are immersed in the history of these things, do you think there's any credibility to the story of her having an ass biter and her committing suicide that way?
I'm trying. It's been years since I did a lot of reading on that particular end of the Roman Republic, and I remember reading an excellent scholarly biography of Julius Caesar that did actually go into that question. Don't quote me, but my recollection is that is a much later story, and that there are a number of accounts. Don't quote me. I don't like speaking off the cuff when I haven't checked my facts. See, people, check your facts. But my recollection is that there's a number of accounts, some which just say that she drank poison, others just say that she committed suicide. And then there's the one about the asp biting her on the breast, which just sort of feels a little bit like one of those stories that would get told because it's a cool story.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't
too
know.
poetic.
Yeah,
I think
it's the one that Shakespeare went with, obviously.
right, exactly. It's too beautifully done to be. Life is much more boring. I think
Yeah.
She probably tripped over one of those marble statues.
Kyle, did the call originate from inside the house?
I'm tracing
get
it
out.
as we speak.
Okay, get out. I've seen the movies. Okay, I know what happens. Okay, so I know we're really running into our hard stop here. So we got 3 quick questions. We're going to knock them out if that's okay. One of them is from Fostering Atheism. Thank you for your super chat, Fostering Atheism. He says, what are Tim's thoughts on Theon of Alexandria? Could his Neoplatonist views caused a retaliation by Christians at the time?
Okay, so Theon, I wish I could have touched on Theon. Theon was Hypatia's dad, and he was the reason that she became a philosopher. In fact, they seem to have worked together on some projects, editing some of the works of Ptolemy, and he was a renowned mathematician and astronomer in his own right. We don't know as much about his philosophical beliefs, though. And actually, one of the sources, Damascus, says that Hypatia kind of struck out on her own and then surpassed him when it came to philosophical study. Keep in mind that mathematics and astronomy were not ends in their own right for these people. They were ways you elevated your mind above the material to apprehend the deity. So we have to keep in mind that these were means to an end for people like Theon and Hypatia. Could his philosophy caused a backlash? Probably not. If he was a Neoplatonist, he would have been very much of the same kind of school of thought as Hypatia, which was highly compatible with Christianity, which is why she had so many Christians, including 3 would-be bishops, as her students. So I don't think that's the case. There's nothing in the evidence to indicate any kind of conflict between Theon and the Christians in the city.
Okay. The next question. Iron Charioteer wants to know, how far flung was the knowledge of the books kept in the library, Oriental, Arabic, and other cultures? Basically, I think he's just asking what scope as far as the distance of other civilizations were found in the library.
Yeah. We're working on some really sketchy information there, and most of it is very, very late. What we can say is the vast majority of books would have been in Greek and on subjects to do with of interest to the Greek-speaking culture, because that was the lingua franca of the entire ancient world in that period for scholars. We do know, as I mentioned, that some of them were in probably Hebrew, possibly Aramaic. We know that there were some works in there from Egypt, and we do know that in the later period there were Latin works. Beyond that, we don't have any evidence that indicates that they had works from places like India, for example, even though they were aware that the Indians had a rich culture.
Okay. And last but not least, somebody had asked if you know anything about the possible Christian burning of Mayan codexes and Incan books.
Yeah, they did.
Was that Cortez?
Sweet.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of them, and sometimes people attack me because they feel that I'm destroying all their wonderful myths. And what I say is, there's plenty of stuff that actually did happen that you can use to beat up Christianity with. So I don't touch that stuff because I don't need to debunk it because it's true. So yeah, that did happen, and you won't find me debunking that because that did happen. And trust me, I'm pissed off about that. The small amount of Aztec stuff that we have is fascinating. Like they wrote beautiful poems about butterflies and hummingbirds and cutting people's hearts out with glass knives.
Nice,
beautiful stuff. They were really interesting people, and we've got almost fucking nothing, and that's a tragedy. So I suppose this is probably a good point to finish on. To all the people who want to try and attack me for not having a PhD in history, or for being apparently a fake atheist, or for not accepting Jesus' mythicism and not kissing Richard Carrier's ass or whatever, fine, go right ahead. All I'd say to you is, if you disagree with me, then make sure you go and read the sources, you educate yourself in the scholarship, and you work from facts, not emotion. Now, if you don't like the big bad man with all the books and stuff, who's taking away your fairy tales, all I'd say is Christianity's still wrong. Jesus wasn't the Son of God. God doesn't exist. None of that changes if Hypatia wasn't killed for the reasons he thought she was, or if the Great Library wasn't burnt down by Christians. You know, if I'm taking away your fairy tales, then all I'd say to you is fucking grow up.
Drop the mic. You know, to hit on that point, you know, I know there it's a contentious issue. Like I was saying before the show started, there are people who will vehemently state that Jesus existed and vehemently deny that he existed. And you know, that's a tougher issue. But when you're talking about things like we touched on tonight, that you have concrete, you know, black or white facts for, I don't know why people would want to argue from a wrong position. You know, like, I know that the story is better, but you're still wrong and can be proven wrong.
This is confirmation bias.
You know,
that's largely it. I mean, look, there are other ways that you can interpret the evidence, and so this is why history isn't like science, where you get definite black and white, right and wrong answers. But what I've just presented is the consensus view of the scholars who have studied this stuff. So you're not disagreeing with me if you don't like what I just said. Go and argue with Edward J. Watts and Maria Dezilska. You know, go and argue with them.
Good point. Well, Tim,
I enjoyed this. Thank you, Tim.
Absolutely. And we talked before about you coming back to do something on the mysticism part. That would be fantastic, I think.
No. He's coming back to do quantum mechanics, remember?
Oh, yeah, of course. How could I forgot?
I'm not touching quantum mechanics. I'm going to leave that.
See, another denial. I'm telling you.
So he will be back with us very soon. I'm going to let you now kind of wrap up any final thoughts you have. Tell people where they can go again to read more in depth. And when you go to his website, make sure that you check out his frequently asked questions section. It's the best done frequently asked questions that I've ever seen. So at least go and read that for sure.
So what I would say is I'm working on a series of articles called the Great Myths series, and the one on the Great Library is number 5 in that series. So you'll find pretty much all the stuff I said with a lot more information in that article. I haven't written the one on Hypatia yet. I'm still really sort of pulling together all the material on that. I hope to get that up probably sometime in the next few months. And look, if you guys will have me back, I'll be happy to come back and talk about the historical Jesus. I'd prefer to talk about the question of how did Christianity begin? Because I think if we focus too much on did Jesus exist or not exist, you get bogged down. I think it's much more interesting to look at, okay, what's the evidence about how Christianity began? That's obviously going to center on whether or not there was a historical guy. So obviously I'll touch on that. But I think I'd like to reframe the question a little bit, because that kind of, I think it gives a broader and better perspective.
I like that. And I actually, if for me speaking openly and honestly, I would like to have you come on over time and hit all of your great myths. I think each one of them is something that should be put out there and talked about. So until you get tired of us, we will keep inviting you back.
Well, if you have me, that's fine. The next article in the Great Myths series on historyforatheists.com is on Copernicus. So it's on the myth that Copernicus was too afraid to publish his theory because he was terrified of the Inquisition, and he only published it on his deathbed to escape the clutches of the Inquisition, which is, I'm going to say it, bullshit. So you can look forward to that. That'll be up in the next couple of weeks.
Now that's fascinating. I would love to do that. You have to. You are now you're part of the show now. We can't let you go, and we never will. So I hope you.
We're gonna hold you tight and cuddle you and love you forever, just like
the next great myth you should do is Steve. There's a big debate on whether or not Steve really exists. So
yeah. A lot of people believe I don't. You'd be surprised. A lot of people
also.
I wrote a blog piece on it. It got so bad.
The great myth about the Great Sphinx. I see that coming down the pipeline.
God, no, I'm not touching that.
Steve,
you were sort of fading in and out of the picture on my screen.
That's true. I mean, people think I'm a Q now, but no. But we've already established triangles don't exist, and you do agree colors don't exist, right?
Yeah.
And then if you go to mereological nihilism, pretty much nothing exists besides atoms. So there you go.
Right. Well, there you go.
Steve's roommate, if you're
Its
watching
objects don't
this,
exist.
hurry up, please, and do what you got to do.
Nothing exists.
But anyway, thank you once again. Go to historyforatheists.com to check out more on that. We will should be in the description now. I'm also going to put the names of the books that Tim mentioned as well about Hypatia, so that you can check those out if you want to. All right, Steve, if you don't have any run-ins with your roommate, I assume that we'll have another show tomorrow. If not, just give me a day at least to hold auditions.
Yeah, if I die tonight in my sleep, just do me a favor. When you have Soulful on, ask them, about what happened.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
We can
that'd be a
soul
great
phone you.
experiment.
Oh, see, now I'm a little excited. I mean,
Yeah.
not about the whole.
Wait.
murder thing, but
Wait, did you just get excited? I'm gonna die tonight.
I just want to see your face when you find out which side of the coin you fell on, being an agnostic.
I'm gonna be right in the middle. I'm staying right here.
Okay, great. Well, all right, guys. Thank you too for joining us tonight. For our patrons, thank you for all of your support. We had a great hangout today with everybody. It was it got heated there for a little bit with something that we'll talk about later on down the road with what we're putting together, but nonetheless, it was fun. And we'll see you here tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we will find out if it is possible that Egypt had a Wi-Fi obelisk. I know the suspense is killing you, but you have to wait till tomorrow to find out.
Good night.